Good morning, everybody. My name is Michal Matrone. I'm the Associate Director of the OCPD, as well as Program Director for Non-Academic Career Development in the office. So welcome to our, 12th and final every month series for this, or 11th and final every month session for this year. This is kind of our second pilot of our Alumni Career Paths session that we're testing out before a more formal launch next year. But so this month we'll be focusing on regulatory and clinical affairs. And I see some familiar names of those who have been exploring different career options. So welcome again to this session. I hope you learn a lot. So this month we're joined by 3 alumni panelists. We have Latika Kohli, who is a postdoc alum. She left UCSF in 2014, and she's currently Associate Program Director for Regulatory Affairs at Genentech. Next, we have Leslie Cruz, who is a graduate school alum from the Chemistry and Chemical Biology program in 2010, and she's Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs at Natera. And last but certainly not least, we have Yelena Kulik, who is a neuroscience PhD alum, most recently from 2019, and is now a clinical science assistant also at Genentech. So welcome to all 3 of you. And so what I do want to start with is just hearing from all of our panelists about kind of the stories that they have from when they were here at UCSF to where they are today, and kind of what were some of the decisions that they made along the way. So this is a question for all of you, and we'll go in alphabetical order. So I think we'll start with you, Leslie. And so the prompt is to just tell us your career story from being at UCSF to your current role, thinking about and for those who are a postdoc, thinking about where you were as a graduate student to the place where you are now. Thinking about what you studied, where you studied, and how your training led to your career and your current position. Focusing on what were some of the decisions that you made along the way. So, would you mind?
Yes, thank you, Michael.
Sure.
I'd like to say, thank you to the organizers for having me on this panel. So I was I graduated from UCSF in 2010. And at the time I knew, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I was kind of, I just wasn't sure, but I went to a postdoc at Stanford in translational medicine. And from there, my professor, 2 things happened actually at the same time. My professor had 2 biotech companies at the time, so she knew of all the non-academic paths. And at the same time, I was pregnant with my second child, and I found out that my child would need surgery upon birth, after birth, and he'd need treatment and surgery. So that made me really rethink what I wanted to do, and I was already, uncertain. So because of those 2 things, one, my professor telling me you should probably go more into industry, and we were trying to decide, and the situation with my child led me to reevaluate everything. So what it came down to, I had already been reading about the FDA and regulations and clinical trials, but I didn't know at the time that there were departments in industry that dealt with, regulatory agencies. So once I made that connection, I started, looking through my network and finding people that were in regulatory affairs. And at the time, these sorts of panel discussions didn't occur. So I really had to, go through as many people as I knew to find people in regulatory. But once I did, I started having informational interviews. I met some in coffee shops, and I really just started asking the questions like, what do you do day to day? How does your scientific training, go into being in regulatory affairs? And they gave me great advice. And in the end, I was reading the FDA website. I saw that there was a free FDA seminar that was happening in Burlingame at the time. So I went to, I went to the seminar, And at the time, my child had already had surgery. He was already having treatment and such, because I wasn't working at this point. So I went to the free FDA seminar, and I met many RA professionals at the seminar, and actually the hiring manager that ended up hiring me for my first position. But I think that path was really learning about the regulations. There is this sense that when you get into regulatory, that you should have some knowledge of it. So I read a lot. There's the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, RAPS, that has online classes, and I had done some of those online classes leading up to that FDA seminar, so that when I got to that seminar, I was able to speak intelligently with the other RA professionals and the hiring manager who ended up hiring me for my first position. So I think and then this was now 7 years ago. And in that time, I've mainly been focused on medical devices. I worked on a drug device combination product, medical devices, and now in vitro diagnostics. And I think I've really found my place in vitro diagnostics and genetic testing.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Let's move on to Latika. So please tell us your story and how you got from UCSF to where you are now.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, Leslie, thank you for sharing that. It's pretty fascinating to see how a peer in the field charted their course, because certainly mine is a little bit different, and so hopefully I can share that. So essentially, I will say that there's a consistent theme in how I've made my decisions in life, and it's primarily been motivated by the fact that early on in my childhood, I lost a few loved ones to breast cancer. And so for me, it's always been that, first I really wanted to go into research, because as a child, I was like, I'm going to go into research and I'm going to learn about science. I'm going to contribute to science and make sure my focus is on therapeutics. And so that was always my motivation. So that was where I ended up, at UAB, deep down south, doing my PhD focused on a neuro-oncology project. I then came to UCSF, still thinking that, yes, I care about translational science, and I'm going to continue there. But when I started my postdoc, very quickly, other sort of considerations stepped in. One, doing the science and in a lab started to not feel enough to me in terms of whether I was truly making an impact, because I felt like I couldn't see a tangible benefit to patients in the disease areas I cared about. And so that started to bother me. There were other aspects, and I love, Mike, that you anchored us all to the values, because I can speak to that. I started thinking about, I got married. So I was like, where's my work-life balance? Why is it that I cannot have dinner with my husband on most days of the week? Because, my mice need me. So it's either a choice between sacrificing those mice and not using them for an experiment versus having dinner with my partner. And so, I felt like I needed to change my profession. Because I did not want there to be a constant battle between choosing work versus, personal life. And and I was aware that there is a possibility because, for example, my husband works in tech, so he could just bring his laptop wherever he wanted and work while I had to be in a lab. So that is something that played on my mind as well. So I will say, in terms of trying to explore opportunities, I actually leveraged a series exactly in these seminars that now I'm speaking at, and I started attending a lot of those. And it was during one of those seminars where a member of the regulatory team at Genentech came and spoke to us about regulatory affairs. My interest was definitely piqued, and there were certain aspects of how she described her role and her job that I felt I could really connect with. So that night, I wrote to her. She graciously left her email address. I wrote to her. and she explained that there's an internship opportunity at Genentech. So I reached out, and that's the path I took. And eventually I got that internship. And that was my stepping stone into the industry, because, you know, once you have that practical experience, doors open anyway. So I will say, certainly kudos to you, Leslie. Yours sounds like a much harder path, and you were very perseverant. I genuinely just leveraged this forum to get to the person I wanted to. So yeah, that's my story.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's great to see kind of that you can do it on your own and teach yourself, take classes, take courses online, or you can seek out internships to get some of that practical experiences as well, and both can be successful. So thank you both for those stories. And I want to turn to Yelena now, who kind of has taken a different path. So remember, this session is both about regulatory and clinical affairs. So, and Yelena, since you were recently here at UCSF yourself, it'd be great to hear about your experience here and how that has led you to your position at Genentech. So I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, yeah, thank you. And thanks, Latika and Leslie. A lot of what you guys have said has resonated with me about wanting to make a difference in patients more directly, and recognizing that it's also important to have a life outside of work. So definitely considerations for me too in my career journey. So as Michael introduced me, I got a PhD at UCSF just a little under a year ago. So I graduated last December, and I was studying homeostatic plasticity. So really fundamental neuroscience, how neurons maintain stable electrical properties. So not even, translational or clinically relevant research. And up until maybe my fourth year of grad school, I was really gung-ho about going the traditional academic path, doing a postdoc, becoming a PI at an academic institution, and just doing basic research. And that was the path I'd been on since I was maybe 18. And I decided I wanted to become a neuroscientist after I'd read, a bunch of popular science books, and then majored in neurobiology as an undergrad, and was involved in various labs at my undergrad institution, and then kept doing bench work. And after maybe a decade of bench work, it stopped being as fun. And my priorities started shifting. So I realized I just didn't enjoy being in the lab as much as I had previously. And as I got older, the reasons for why I was in science started to change too. So my grandmother has Parkinson's dementia, and it's a really devastating disease. And I saw the impacts it had on my family, and I realized, like, hey, I'm a neuroscientist. Like, I could do something about this. And so the type of research that I was doing started to feel a little bit disconnected from the real problems that I was seeing in my life, and people that I loved. As well, there was a medical doctor who was doing his postdoc at our lab. So I had a lot of conversations with him, just learning more about the clinical side of research, and starting to, want more of a connection to patients, and have more of an impact on their life through my research and my skills that I've been developing in graduate school. And then the second component was just, as Latika was talking about, I met someone who was a wonderful person who's now my husband, and that changed my life a little bit. I started to, maybe not want to devote my entire life to science, and have, some time outside of the lab to, spend with this awesome person who entered into my life, and starting to question, like, did I want to move to a different city to do a postdoc, and then say I'm successful and I go on the faculty job market? Does that mean I'm going to force him to move to Missouri or whatever the one institution is that will hire me? And then, from my financial point of view too, things started to not really add up. I felt like I wanted more security. I wanted to be able to stay in the Bay Area and build my life with my husband. So I started to search around and see what other jobs I could pursue with a PhD in neuroscience that weren't necessarily academic, but were still in the realm of science, and the parts of science that were fun for me, which centered around, critical thinking, coming up with experimental designs, interpreting data, thinking about data, but also maybe have more of an impact on patients. So I joined the MIND program, and I learned about informational interviewing and how to do, career exploration. And then what led me to clinical science specifically was a little bit serendipitous. So I'm also a rock climber, and one of my climbing partners was a clinical scientist at Gen Tech. And we actually had just never talked about work in the whole time that we'd been climbing together for like over a year. And then one day at the crag, I was like, so what exactly do you do at work? And he was like, oh, you know, like I'm a clinical scientist. So I was like, so you're working with patient samples? And he's like, no, I actually don't do any bench work at all. And so I just never heard of it before. And I was like, oh, like I just always assumed he was processing biopsies or something. And he was like, no, I actually just design clinical trials in oncology. And, you know, I evaluate the data, interpret the data, and it's entirely like office work. And, you know, so I started the conversation with him, and I realized like, oh, this is actually something that aligns with my values of, you know, wanting to help patients, and also my skills and interests, which is still, you know, in the realm of science, like designing trials and, you know, working with data. So then after that, I started to reach out to other clinical scientists. So he was able to connect me for informational interviews with a few other clinical scientists at Gen Tech. And then I also just started looking for people on LinkedIn, you know, reaching out to clinical scientists in the Bay Area, hearing their stories. And I also tried to get a little bit more experience working on clinical trials or anything clinical research related. So it also happened at the time. Actually, I think it's still going on. There was a phase 3 clinical trial for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of severe post-traumatic stress disorder going on at UCSF. And I knew someone who knew the clinical research coordinator working on that study. So I was able to volunteer for that study as a night attendant, actually working with patients and attending to them after the therapy overnight and reporting adverse events to the therapist in the morning, which was really cool, because the patients were just so grateful to be there and, you know, really wanted to help the science, and just, you know, actually seeing the patient experience was really helpful to me. And at the same time, I also, in my free time, took a Coursera class on the design and interpretation of clinical trials through Johns Hopkins University, and earned a certificate through that too. So I was just trying to fill in these gaps however I could, because I didn't have industry experience, to try to, you know, make myself marketable, even though I was just like a PhD with no job experience. And unfortunately, through the informational interviews, it sounded like to become a clinical scientist, you had to have years of experience in industry. Most people got there through a circuitous route, like they worked in operations for 5 years, and then, you know, because they were working closely with this team, they took a chance on them and took them onto the team as a clinical scientist. I didn't hear from, I don't think, a single person who went directly into clinical science right out of their PhD. But I spoke with multiple people who got into it right out of their MD or PharmD through a clinical science fellowship program at Gen Tech. So it's a 2-year, it's like a postdoc, or it's like a transition program to bring them in from professional school into industry. And there was no similar program for PhDs. But a few people had told me that Gen Tech was trying to create one for PhDs. And someone even got me in contact with the person who was trying to put this program together, who is now my boss. So they emailed her, and they're like, hey, like I talked to this PhD student, she's super interested in clinical science. I heard you're trying to put together like a PhD training program in clinical science for new PhDs. And she's like, oh, great, like it's still in the works, like I'll add you to the wait list. And then I did another informational interview with someone else, and they're like, oh, there's this PhD training program. And they like email her again. And this happened multiple times. So I was like definitely on her radar. I was probably a little bit annoying, but she knew I was like really interested, like 6 months before they even created this program. So then when they finally posted the job, she emailed me directly, and she's like, hey, I just posted the job, like if you want to apply. So I was probably the first person to apply too. I was like maybe overly eager, but it seemed like it was probably my best opportunity to get my foot in the door. And so then I interviewed and I landed the job, and I finished my PhD on a Friday, and I started the new job at Gen Tech on that Monday. So I've been in the program for about a year. My official title is clinical science assistant. There's multiple levels of positions in clinical science. It varies depending on the company as far as the titles, but at Genentech it's clinical science assistant, then associate clinical scientist, senior clinical scientist, and principal clinical scientist. So I'm at the very bottom level, but I'm getting a lot of exposure to clinical trials, and it's actually, I think, probably the best way I could have thought to transition in, because I walked in there thinking like, well, I'm a scientist, I have a PhD, I can design an experiment, but there's so much more that comes with, working with humans. And then also with the way industry is structured, working in these huge teams, these cross-functional teams, where we're working with regulatory partners and, we're working with operations. So I'm definitely still early in my career path, and I'm still learning, but it's definitely been the right choice for me so far. So don't regret it at all.
Thank you so much, Yelena. That was great. And if you have any information about that program, it'd be great to make it available to those who are attending today, but it's something we could put up on our website as another option for people to get more experience as an entry path into to clinical affairs. So, but I think for you definitely exemplified how important networking is to get to the career of your choice. But then all of you exemplified how important your values played, the values you used to have, how important they were in the decisions that you did make, and that there isn't such boundaries between and for values as there are skills and interests when it comes to how your personal life and your professional life kind of intermix. You can separate what you're interested in doing and the skills you have into kind of a professional bucket, but when it comes to values, there is no clear boundary between the two, and one influences the other very readily. So thank you all for sharing that. I do want to switch. So before we go into the next question, I just want to remind everyone too that all three of our panelists kindly answered some pre-questions for all of you, so that you'll have a record of what do they do on a day-to-day basis, what are some of the skills needed. So that should be in your email if you signed up in advance for this session. If you're crashing this session, then those questions will be available online and on the every month page dedicated to this topic. So you can find them there as well. So I do want to, the one question that we will be adding to that questionnaire, and I do want to ask it here today for all of you, and that is for our international scholars. So many of you know, like half of our postdocs at UCSF are foreign nationals, and they many or very often are looking to stay in the US and find jobs outside of academia. So and this is for all three of you. So do you have any information about how your company hires international scholars at there's just two represented here, so at Genentech or Natera. So can you share anything about being a foreign national scholar that you may know, or you yourself, and getting a job in the US in industry?
So far I've been hiring manager, and so far what I've seen is transitions from H1 visas, and I do know that our company does work. So my company does an initial interview with HR and the candidate, and they work out any details if a visa is needed, or if they're a U.S. citizen. But that is usually handled up front, so that we know, if the person will need like a visa transfer, or will need to apply for a work visa. But we do definitely have a work visa.
I guess from a Genentech, and then I guess just given Genentech is such a big organization, and I know different positions come with I guess different requisites. I would say for regulatory, like the internship I was referring to, for example, I did confirm in advance of this panel discussion that they are open to supporting a wide range of visa types, as long as the candidate is the right fit for the job. So, I have gotten that confirmation that they would be willing to support a range of visas.
Mm-hmm. That has been my experience as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that, and just, if in case somebody doesn't know about it here, like Genentech is one of the few pharmaceutical or industry companies that has its own J program as well. So because it has training positions, has postdoc positions, and so it has its own J program similar to what an academic institution would have. So thank you for your information on that question. I want to talk a little bit about, and related to just the ongoing tumultuousness in the US now with, aside from COVID, but, the racial and social inequities that are going on in the US right now, and ask about, like, what does inclusivity look like at your companies? So many of, all of myself included, everybody that's participating here really has only experience in academia and know what that environment could be like. So what was it like going into a non-academic environment, and how you felt included, or what the inclusivity looks like for your company? And this is a question for all of you.
So this is Latika. I can go first. I will say that just as you mentioned, Mike, given the times we are in, it was interesting to see how Genentech leadership would respond to the events, and what learnings would be highlighted, what would be the message or the tone set by the leadership on expected behaviors, especially in these times. And I've never felt more proud, I will say, to work for this organization. I've certainly felt even more educated on concepts that I thought I was clear about. For me, and I'll just admit it, for me, I felt like, the conversation ends at diversity, just making sure you have the right mix of people. And I'd never really consciously thought about what does proactive inclusivity look like, right? Like, how do you create that? How do you make that mix work? You might have a mix of people, but do you marginalize people, or do you do certain people feel like they're not heard in a room, right? Like, what do you do with differences? So it's been amazing. It's been an amazing educational experience. It's been great to see the senior leadership walk the line on and really implement proactive measures and guidances on making sure everyone feels heard in a room. And if there are people that are different, if any of us are different for some reason, let's celebrate those differences. Let's not hide them under the rug and be like, okay, no, let's not pretend we're not seeing something. No, we are all different, but we have a common goal. Let's work towards it, and let's leverage the uniqueness instead of calling them differences. These are our unique aspects, whether it's your gender, your identity, your race, your ethnicity. So there have been lots of community circles, really highlighting these values. We've all been encouraged to speak up if we see something, regardless of hierarchy. And there's just a sense that nothing beyond, it's like if you don't engage in the sort of proactive behavior that the organization would like to see, that's not going to be tolerated. So it's like it's a very clear black and white, guidance here that, this is expected. Like you do the right thing.
Yeah, I have to say I've had pretty much the same experience at Genentech. I've been very impressed. So I was a little, worried because you hear things about industry and business and, especially, well, maybe it's more tech, like Silicon Valley, but I was blown away. Yeah, really positive experience.
Yeah, and myself as well. I mean, Natera's main focus is on women's health. So there is a lot of focus on inclusion. I've been with Natera for over 4 years at this point. And when I got to Natera, I could tell the level of inclusion was very high compared to other companies I had been at. And they really, the senior leaders would go out of their way to make sure that everyone was heard, that everyone's opinion was heard and addressed. And also, with the events of this year, our senior management was, very, very direct in saying that, they didn't want to see any, just so I put it correctly, that they didn't, that basically like, any bigotry or anything would be not tolerated whatsoever at Natera. And not that I had seen it, because like I said, the experience I've had has just been fantastic. But, given the events of this year, it was so, assuring that, our senior management was like, any behavior like this will just not be tolerated. It'll just be zero tolerance towards it. But, even when working in projects, so all the projects I work on are cross-functional across the organization. And, we do a very good job of including everyone, of getting everyone's viewpoints, of, celebrating our differences. And, a kind of thing that usually happens if there's there's a special celebration in your culture, like we'll bring in stuff and celebrate it at lunchtime. And it's really great to see, all of these different things from different cultures that I wouldn't be aware of otherwise. So that's been really fantastic. This is, of course, when we were still in the office. But yeah, it's been great. I really love, the diversity and inclusion aspect of Natera, because they have it, they're doing it very well.
Thank you all for sharing that. I think that's, one of the goals of this kind of program is not only to help inform our students and postdocs about the different career paths, but to identify places to work where they'll feel like they belong and that they're included and that their voices are heard. Mm-hmm. Because that's not necessarily information that you could get a full picture of just by looking online or seeing a statement in a job ad. It's great to hear from the people who are working there and experiencing it for themselves. So I want to just to change gears a little bit to go to kind of like the career path more broadly. Is what does the typical career path for someone in either regulatory affairs or clinical affairs look like? So like from where you are now to like what are the next steps for you is also part of this question. So like where can someone go in the regulatory affairs field or clinical affairs field, and where do you see yourself moving to next? And again, this is for all of you as well. So we'll go in reverse order this time. So why don't, Leslie, you start us off?
Yes. So right now I'm a senior manager of regulatory affairs. I started as a regulatory affairs associate. I've always worked on submissions, the actual writing and so forth of the submissions, regulatory strategy development. And as I moved up, I was an associate, then I was a specialist, senior specialist, and now manager, then senior manager. And as my title has moved up, so have my responsibilities. I have 2 RA specialists that report to me who are also working on submissions and regulatory strategies for a variety of programs of projects that are going on in our company. The next step for me would be to be an associate director. And really, at that point, I would just be more involved with more higher level regulatory strategy and, and as products are coming online. So right now it's very exciting in genetic testing. And basically the FDA doesn't have clear regulations for our products. So we're working very closely with FDA to see what those regulations would look like for our products, which is very exciting. Yeah, and it's basically responsibilities go up as you move up the food chain.
Thank you. Elena, you touched on it a little bit, but can you speak, a bit about like what the career path in clinical affairs looks like?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm unusual because I'm the first ever PhD fellow. So I don't think I'm typical. As I mentioned, it seems like there's no one typical path for getting into clinical affairs. People tend to start out in other functions within drug development, and then after some period of time move into clinical science if they have a PhD background. But I do want to make one correction. I just remembered there was one person I did an informational interview with who did a PhD project on like one type of cancer. I think it's like some rare form of cancer, and he got hired as a clinical scientist by a pharmaceutical company right out of his PhD because they were trying to develop a program around this type of cancer, and he was an expert in this. So I think you could leverage that to get into clinical science if you just happen to be the perfect match. Like they'll just invest in you and train you. After you get into clinical science, I think I mentioned you progress up titles, assistant, then clinical scientist, senior clinical scientist, and principal clinical scientist. I think this is mostly based on the number of years of experience or level of experience. Above that, that's like the top tier of clinical science. People will continue to grow into other leadership roles that aren't specific to clinical science, but more like leading the global development of an entire molecule or like leading an entire department. So they're no longer fulfilling the clinical science role, but they're serving as leadership beyond that. So I don't know where I'll find myself to be most comfortable, but I'm definitely interested in clinical science for now.
Yeah, and sorry, just to mention, I forgot to mention that, after associate director, it would be director, senior director, and then a VP of regulatory affairs.
Thank you. Latika, what does this look like at Genentech?
Yeah, so so Genentech, we're primarily a pharma company and focused on drugs. So really, my role is in drug regulatory affairs, as opposed to, as Leslie mentioned, she's in the IVD diagnostic space. So I'm in drug regulatory affairs, and the way I've seen my responsibilities evolve is that when I first started out, I was supporting a regional lead, so let's say the US regulatory lead, on a molecule or maybe a slew of molecules, right? Then as I progressed and so on, I started taking on a more independent role, again, from a regional perspective on a molecule. So again, as let's say the US partner on a particular molecule, and then the scope tends to increase. So you then take on multiple molecules and try to prioritize what molecules you're picking up based on how you want to expand your breadth of experience. So let's say I started out in the heme-onc space, I then moved to the breast cancer space, then to lung cancer, so that I could keep expanding my breadth of experience, because there's, the regulatory landscape looks different from even like within these indications. From then on, of course, everyone's path looks different. I've had peers who've decided, just because while being in regulatory, you interact so much with cross-functional colleagues and you're always learning about these different functions. I've had colleagues who've jumped into clinical science who are now clinical scientists. I know someone who went into biostats because, again, these are all PhDs and postdocs. So we have the foundational learning to actually jump into any of these spaces. For me, what I ended up doing is, again, leveraging the fact that Genentech encourages rotations. So, after a certain point, when you've really established yourself as being stable in your area, you can do a rotation. So I chose to do a rotation in digital health. So we have this newly formed organization called Personalized Healthcare. They're working on digital health applications and so on. So I chose to stay in regulatory, but contribute to the evolving space in figuring out how digital apps should be developed. Should they be regulated? Should they not be regulated? You know, what's the difference between a wellness app and let's say an app that helps manage symptoms for a patient who's on a cancer drug versus one that can actually help a patient do better on a cancer drug just because they're using that app in tandem, right? So I thought that was a fascinating field. So I just completed a one-year rotation there, and my department was totally supportive. And now I'm going to come back and help on projects where we can figure out how to integrate such solutions into our oncology trials. So that's an area I was passionate about. So I guess for me, I've been, you know, different people do it differently. Some people feel, you know, like they would like to see that upward trajectory in one area. Some feel like, you know what, I'd like to get more breadth of experience. Some feel like, let me go to a different area altogether outside of regulatory. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's what motivates you and what you think is fun. So for me, I felt like I want to get a little bit more horizontal learning before I move up into let's say a global role in drug regulatory. I want to, you know, maybe just diversify a little bit more before I move into a global role. So, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the possibilities are endless. I mean, you can really choose to chart your own course and literally know like, you know, all of us, our trajectories look very different in regulatory, and how we are charting our course looks very different. But yeah, you kind of own your development.
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Latika said. I think this is very much the case for clinical science at Genentech too. So I just described like the linear path, but you know, I know clinical scientists who have gone into personalized healthcare or have gone into innovation, and you know, you're definitely not stuck on the clinical scientist path. We're like definitely encouraged to explore other options within the company. And as well, similar to what you were saying about jumping across therapeutic areas, I should have mentioned this as well. You know, I think in academia, you become an expert in one thing and then you're pigeonholed and you just stay there forever. Whereas in clinical science, the tendency is for clinical scientists to work on many different diseases throughout the course of their career. So you could be supporting a molecule for breast cancer, and then, you know, that clinical trial ends, whether or not it's a positive or negative result, it's done. So you got to move on to a new position, and then you might go into, you know, heart disease or go into Alzheimer's. And this is seen as a positive thing to have expertise in many different therapeutic areas, because you can bring learnings from one therapeutic area to another therapeutic area. So people are definitely encouraged to move around, and it's viewed as a positive thing. So this is one of the beauties of clinical science, I think. And it sounds like for regulatory too, you can move around different areas, as you just never get bored because you're always learning about something new. Like right now, actually, I think I forgot to mention, I'm not working on neuroscience. I'm working on inflammatory bowel disease. So I'm learning all about the gut and the microbiome. And before that, I'd never researched anything below the neck. So it's actually really fun.
Yeah, and I think the difference here is, you know, Genentech is a very large company. Natera, we're still, I always say we're like at the teenager phase right now. So our main focus is genetic testing, and what the three therapeutic areas that we have is women's health, oncology, and transplant. But we're still using our same technology of monitoring cell-free DNA through, you know, genetic testing analysis. So it's very exciting, but I can see the differences here between, you know, a much smaller, younger company compared to Genentech, which is very well established. But I think, you know, even in the time that I've been in regulatory affairs, I've had a variety of experiences working on different, you know, like I was mentioning before, I worked on a drug device combination product, which was regulated as a drug, but also incorporated some medical device regulations as well, since it was a combination product. In my second experience, I had optical coherence tomography equipment, which is capital equipment that an ophthalmologist will have to scan the back of the eye to see a variety of different things. One of them being, retinal degeneration, or, if we were having cataract surgery, they would use the device to see exactly where the cataract was, so they knew where to perform the surgery. And then now at Natera, being in the genetic testing space. So, certainly in regulatory, you can move around, and like Tika said earlier, the regulations vary greatly depending on your product. Even within the drug space or medical device space or in vitro diagnostics, it varies greatly depending on your exact product.
Thank you all for that perspective. I think it kind of reminds us that it all really comes back down to your values and what's important to you. Like if you want to work for a company that gives you the flexibility to, to get some horizontal learning and go to a different kind of therapeutic area or to, to some even different functional area, then that is a place that you should look for a job at a place like Genentech, because I know that other bigger companies have a similar model that they have, they allow their employees to, to take a rotation somewhere else in the company to learn something new. And I think that's important because then you understand like how does the whole process work from, at least for a pharmaceutical company, from the research side all the way to the clinical trial and approval side, and with the regulatory stuff in between. So, but if that's not important to you, then you can look for jobs elsewhere. So, or, that you don't have to do that in the company if you were to, go to Genentech. So thank you for putting that perspective on for all of us. So,
yeah. And also just to add to that, Michael, being in regulatory affairs, you're exposed to all of the different cross-functional teams. So you're also exposed to all of their learnings, because as you build a regulatory submission, you're pulling from clinical trials. You're speaking with product development. You're working with R&D to add in all of the information that you need to have into a regulatory submission. And then, as you build it, as you speak with regulatory authorities, you have to have that knowledge as well, so that you can have those conversations with regulatory authorities. So and I feel like in regulatory, it's constant learning. You are always learning about your product. You're always learning about regulations. And I think, in terms of values, is having that, always wanting to learn, always wanting to know what's new, is, I think, definitely something, for a regulatory affairs professional, because it's not a static job. Everything is always changing at any given moment.
thank you so much.